Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am the City Witch and today we're going to be conducting a book review. But before I jump into the book, let's get all the YouTube jargon out the way first. So hi and welcome to all my regular and brand new followers. Thank you so much for your support and for tuning in today. If you enjoy the video by the time you get to the end, please give me a thumbs up, click the bell and YouTube will tell you when my next video comes out. If you'd like to offer like, love and support to my channel, you can do that through my PayPal or Amazon link. Both are provided on the description of the video. If you'd like to get in touch with me to book any of my magical services, divinations, or just simply ask me a question about any of my videos or magical subjects, you can do that through Instagram, Facebook, X, or via email. All the links are provided on the description of the video, guys. So thank you so much for tuning in and supporting me and watching my video. If you are new to my channel and you've never seen me do one of these book reviews before, it's quite simple. I have read the book from cover to cover. I've made plenty of notes on the positives and the negatives, splitting them up so I can walk you through what I personally thought in regards to this book. I will go through all of the contents of the book and talk about the various chapters one at a time. At the end, I will let you know if the book has made it into my personal collection and will stay in my magical library, and what I've scored the book from 1 to 10 as. I score every single book. If a book is a 10 out of 10, it's extremely rare, but it does happen. It means it was absolutely 100% fantastic. If I score it 1 out of 10, it was probably the worst book I've ever read. And if it is anywhere above a 5 out of 10, chances are I'm probably keeping it because it's a decent quality book. If it's below a 5 out of 10, it probably isn't being kept because it doesn't offer me anything of relevance to my personal practice. All of this is obviously my personal opinion on the book, but I am walking you through all of the contents of the book and letting you know what is contained within before you purchase it. If you do have any questions about the book or anything you'd like to know, or if you want me to take a closer look at something in this book that you have a question about in regards to Ancestor Veneration, which is the book review we're doing today, then please leave a comment on the video. I do check every single day for comments and inquiries. So today's book is Honouring Your Ancestors, a Guide to Ancestral Veneration by Mallory Vadozzi. And I hope I'm saying her name right. If I'm butchering it, my apologies. This is what the book looks like. It's a gloss book and it's probably actually a little bit smaller than A5. I was about to say it's A5 size, but it's not. It's probably a little bit smaller than A5. It's a fairly slimish book as well, although it does contain quite a bit of information. Let's read the back of the book and see what it says. Discover the spiritual nourishment and magical power of ancestor veneration. Learn how to connect to your ancestors and receive the benefits that come from veneration, such as deep spirituality, more love in your life, better outcomes in creative pursuits, powerful magic and spell work, and an important sense of wellness. Filled with hands-on techniques and tips, Honouring Your Ancestors shows you how to create an ancestral altar so you can work with ancestors of all kinds. Author Mallory Vadozzi also shares fascinating ideas for incorporating rituals, spells, family recipes, and even practices like music and dancing to help you open this wonderful new dimension of your spiritual journey. Ancestor veneration is one of the most widespread spiritual practices in the world. This book shares the important distinctions between working with blood ancestors, lineage ancestors, and affinity ancestors, while helping you recognize the signs that your ancestors are responding to your petitions and offerings. You will also explore important topics like mediumship and ancestral trauma, so you can be sure to develop a veneration practice that is uplifting and affirming for you. Okay, so let's take a look at the chapters. Here we go. So the contents of the book is as follows. So we get an introduction. In the introduction, we learn some information about the author, Mallory. So what we discover is she's a Catholic Italian pagan who lives currently in New York City. So she was raised Italian, so has a lot of Catholic information and knowledge, and that shows as you progress through the book. She later in life decided to become a pagan or a witch, so you get quite a blend of different things throughout this book. So there is some witchcraft in it with rituals and spells, but then also for the Catholic aspect there are prayers, working with the palms and the saints, and some very religious information. So my first thing that I got from this book was because of her religious background in Catholicism. This would be a really good book for those of you out there who are Christian witches, Catholic witches, or prefer a religious structured approach to your practice in witchcraft or paganism. This is probably going to offer you that, especially in regards to the topic of ancestor veneration. However, if you don't like working with the palms and the Bible, you might struggle to separate a lot of that from the subjects in this book, because Mallory included a lot of religion, a lot of Catholic ways of doing things throughout the book, and it's very difficult to change it or separate it from what she's saying. So it might annoy some people out there that are not Catholic, but for those of you who are, this would be a really good book. Chapter 1, who are the ancestors? So in that chapter, let's just take a quick look, so I think it'd be worth having a quick nose. So here she breaks down the ancestors. So she talks about blood ancestors that are directly connected to you, recently deceased relatives and how to work with them or deal with them, lineage ancestors, adoption. So there is a little bit about that, although it's a very tiny section, guys. Previous books I've read, I've had entire chapters on the subject, or at least a good chunk of information, going into greater detail about what to do if you are adopted, and how to connect with ancestors from your adoptive relatives. Then we have partnerships. So this is when you get married or you're with a lifelong partner. Can you connect to their bloodline, their ancestors? Then we have initiation. So if you are initiated into a family or a religion where you take on other spirits and ancestors that become part of who you are and your practice. That was quite interesting. Affinity ancestors. So these are ancestors that are not directly related to you, so not part of your bloodline. So friends and, people you consider to be family, but they're not actually blood related to you. Then we have saints, and that was a little bit interesting to me. I don't know why the saints were put in there. And honestly, I thought it was because she was trying to say, oh, you might have a saint as a relative, because saints were living people. But that actually wasn't it at all. It was just working with the saints with your ancestors. And while I know there are other spirits that work alongside ancestors, and you can include your ancestors with working with other types of spirits, I personally felt that wasn't necessary there. I think she could have just done a generic list of, these are a list of other spirits you can potentially work with alongside your ancestors, and then just list them. I don't think they needed their own kind of chunk of information in the book. She then goes on to talk about spirit guides in general, then ghosts, and then related spirits. And related spirits covered land spirits, house spirits, and non-human ancestors. You're not going to have non-human ancestors for a start. So that was misworded, in my opinion, or mislabeled, if you prefer that term. Land spirits and house spirits, they're a different type of spirit entirely. They don't have anything to do with ancestor veneration. While you can honour the house spirits next to your ancestors on a shared altar, that is personal to your practice and a personal choice. And it's not how she worded it in the book either. She just kind of included this random information. So to me, this book should have been just about ancestors. Didn't need to have this extra information in it about working with other types of spirits. If you want that, you would have bought a book on working with spirits. And most of those include ancestor work and working with the beloved dead. So you get both of the best worlds, because ancestors are still a type of spirit, but they're a specific category of spirit. So I don't understand why she put these other spirits in there, because to me, it honestly wasn't needed. And it is, in a sort of roundabout way, introducing you to working with other spirits, which you might not yet be ready for. Then a ritual to connect with your ancestors, and it's not actually really a ritual, guys. It's more like a visualization or meditation, so not a true ritual. She gives you some final thoughts on that chapter, and at the end of every chapter you do get some journal prompts. Now, going back to the chapters, healing ancestral trauma. So here Mallory discusses ancestral trauma and what that is. And I have issues with that particular chapter, because Mallory approaches that from a position that as a living relative of your bloodline, you are responsible for healing ancestral trauma. And I don't like the way it was worded, because it implies it's your responsibility, putting all of someone else's issues and problems and traumas on you, on your shoulders. And you should never shoulder somebody else's issues, whether they're alive or dead. The other thing is she makes it your responsibility to deal with that ancestral trauma, saying you must heal it. And the wording again is very strong and incorrect, because you should never force healing upon anyone, dead or alive, if they're not ready for it. You can absolutely help them with their healing journey. You can get involved in that journey and you can offer your assistance, but you should never be forcing it upon them. And for many ancestors out there, some of them might not even realize it's a trauma. They might not have a word or a term for it. They might not know how to deal with it or be ready to deal with it. And just as another thought, some of the things we consider to be a trauma now, to them, could have been completely and utterly normal. And they don't want to heal it because to them, there's nothing to heal. There's no issue. So it brought up a number of issues for me, that particular chapter, and I was not a fan of it. Chapter 3, building your ancestral altar. This is probably one of the best chapters in the book. She covers all the basics in regards to altars and gives lots of beautiful suggestions for placing altars around the home, for how to incorporate your ancestors in your home and everyday life by building small shrines and altars. And they can be as simple as one candle or as, splendid as an entire bookcase shelf. So she talks about that and different areas of the house you can put your altar. She even gives you references to typical traditional places an altar would be put for ancestors in the home from different religions around the world. She talks about her own Catholic Italian background as well, and where they would typically put the altar. And one of the things I thought was dead sweet in that chapter was she does mention how the altar is always somewhere where all of the family can interact with it, and everyone from the eldest to the youngest is encouraged to interact with the altar. So there was comments like, the children in the house would say good morning to the altar and to the ancestors, place things to be blessed by the ancestors on the altar, say good night as they go into bed. And it was just really cute and sweet to read. So there was some really good, pleasant information in that chapter, and for me it was one of the better chapters in the book. Chapter 4, making offerings to your ancestors. So here she breaks down the kinds of offerings, and she does it in two ways. She talks about traditional religious offerings through history that were commonly done. She mentions things that absolutely should always be included on your ancestral altar and why. And then she covers just a few extra things you might want to include or consider. The one thing she didn't do in that chapter though was she didn't really get down to putting offerings on the altar that are very specific to family members. So reading other books, other authors mentioned how if you know of a specific ancestor, so as an example, I have Scottish ancestors, those writers mentioned why not include things on the altar that makes them feel at home, things that would have commonly been seen or used in everyday life by those particular ancestors. So when I thought about it, I was like, okay, well, the thistle is a symbol of Scotland. I could put dried thistles in a vase on my altar. The kilt, I have a family kilt and I know exactly what the kilt is for my family line. So I could put a piece of that fabric on the altar or have it as the altar cloth itself if I'm just working with my Scottish ancestors. So those books kind of helped me go that bit deeper and get more personal with my altar, whereas Mallory failed to do that in my opinion. And even though she talks about offerings, again, she doesn't get personal with it. So one of the things I would recommend is actually giving offerings that typically those ancestors would have consumed. So my Scottish ancestors would have eaten haggis. They would have eaten broths that would have been brewing all day, making the house smell amazing. They would have baked their own bread. Many of them worked in coal mines, so I could put a piece of coal as an offering on the altar. So get specific and personal with your offerings, and that is something that Mallory failed to do with that chapter, although what she does give as information is good. Chapter 5, praying to and for the ancestors. So here again, we see her Catholic heritage coming into play. She uses the Bible quite a bit and the Psalms, and she talks about prayer from a very religious perspective. But I do want to say that if you ignore the religious aspect, you can also figure out ways to create your own prayers to your ancestors. You can pray to your ancestors. Prayer is not limited to Christianity and Catholicism. You can absolutely pray if you want to. I pray to my ancestors. I just designed all my own prayers, and instead of saying, amen at the end, I always say, blessed be, or so shall it be, or thank you for hearing me, something along those lines. So consider that chapter a little bit of a one you'll have to work on, but it's still got some really excellent information in it. Chapter 6, spiritual hygiene. For me, this chapter was a complete and utter waste of time. This chapter focused on generic spiritual hygiene as opposed to specific ancestral hygiene. And ways to work with spiritual cleansing by incorporating your ancestors. In fact, not one of the rituals and exercises she gives in that chapter actually calls upon your ancestors for anything. It's just smudging and cleansing your home. It's clearing away old offerings that are food related, maintaining your altar, having a cleansing bath. It's really generic stuff that has absolutely no relevance to ancestral work whatsoever. So I honestly think if she was going to include that chapter, it should have been more specific to ancestors, like asking your ancestors to bless your bath water, mixing up herbs and ingredients and having it on their altar to bless before you bathe in it, something along those lines. And what to use to traditionally cleanse your altar and clear away old offerings, what to do with those old offerings, things along those lines to maintain spiritual hygiene and positive energy in the home that is very specific to ancestor veneration. But she failed to do that, and to me that chapter, while good and has a lot of good information in it, was fairly useless. If you are someone that is approaching ancestor veneration because you've got the basics down in witchcraft, the chances are very, very high, in fact I'd probably say they're 10 out of 10, that you will have already covered the subject of cleansing extensively and know at least the basics. So you do not need this book to include that in it. So for me, that was a complete waste of a chapter and could have been replaced by another topic in this book. Then we go into Mediumship is for Everyone, chapter 7. So Mallory approaches mediumship from the position that anyone can be a medium. Everyone has the ability to be a medium. She states very clearly in that chapter that she herself is not a medium. She doesn't know anything about mediumship, and she is not in a position to talk about it because she doesn't know anything about the subject, but yet she felt it's okay to put 2 entire chapters in this book on mediumship, because chapter 8, directly after chapter 7, is going deeper with mediumship. So both of those 2 chapters, guys, were pretty poor quality. She herself said she's not a medium, but she spoke on the topic. It shows that she is not a medium because she completely confused mediumship with psychic abilities. She blended the 2 together, used exercises that are more for training you as a psychic than actually a medium. She failed to talk about mediumship tools, what mediumship is, and how to connect with the currents of the dead and speak with the dead using these various tools of mediumship. So because of that, for me, those chapters were just awful. Going deeper with mediumship in chapter 8, that was just exercises that were, first of all, not going deeper. They weren't advanced exercises. They were just basic exercises. They also weren't strictly mediumship exercises. One of them was dream work. And I was like, that actually is a category on its own in witchcraft and has nothing to do with mediumship. So it generally showed she didn't know what she was talking about, basically. So for me, those chapters were also a complete and utter waste of time and should not have been included in this book. If she really wanted to talk about mediumship, she should have had someone collaborate on this book who is a medium, who knows what they're talking about. Chapter 9, Herbal Allies for Ancestor Veneration. So this was a list of herbs and ingredients that are typically associated with the dead, with ancestors, and working with ancestral guides. The list was fairly good. It had good information. It, as far as I could tell, was correct information and was, just an okay subject. But I found it quite dull, a little bit of a letdown. And I personally would have preferred, rather than it be a specific chapter on just herbal allies, why not a full list of correspondences that connect to ancestors? So crystals for meditation, visualization and prayer work with your ancestors. Why not colours typically associated with the altar and working with ancestors? And why not a list of generic offerings and then a little insight into very specific offerings you can do? Why not some pictures of different ancestral altars to give you ideas on how to build your altar? Why not flowers and herbs and food that is commonly associated with the dead and ancestors? Pomegranates are associated with the underworld. That's a very generic offering given in Greece and in Greek practices for connecting with the dead and making an offering to the dead and the underworld. So there's things that she could have gone a bit further with in that, rather than than just doing herbs. So while the chapter was good and the information was good, I would have preferred a full list of correspondences there, not just herbs. Chapter 10, calling on the ancestral power. So here is basically a list of rituals and ways to connect with your ancestors. She comes at it from a very religious perspective, yet again, working with the palms in the Bible. A lot of what she gives, I personally wouldn't include in my practice, and I struggled with that chapter quite a lot because I didn't think it was particularly very witchy. She talks about the power of the ancestors a little bit in that chapter, but she doesn't give any actual ways to incorporate them in your magical practice. It's more like just telling you they're powerful and here's a ritual on how to call upon them, but it doesn't go any further than that. So to me, it was a little bit of a letdown. Chapter 11, a selection of spells. This was the worst chapter in the entire book, in my opinion. These spells are not spells. They are at best prayers or little folksy talismans and charms. They're not actually really proper spells, and you don't actually do any casting. You don't actually do anything that would be considered to be a typical spell in witchcraft. It's more something you would do if you were religious, beliefs and maybe, what am I looking for here? So yeah, it's just basically like, belief, superstition. That's another word. Some of it is superstitious stuff. It's not actually really spell work. So that for me was very disappointing because I thought we were going to get spells in that chapter that would focus our power and energy by tapping into the ancestors and asking them to aid us in various areas of witchcraft. But no, a lot of the spells aren't even anything to do with ancestors. There's a spell in there on how to ask your ancestors to help someone get over nightmares or protect them in their sleep. And I'm like, okay, but there are other ways of going about that. So to me, the chapter was just a little bit, just not great. Then we conclude the book with remembering the future. And that was, setting yourself up for success by writing down everything you know about your ancestors and, leaving it for generations to come in the future and working with the ancestors more in your practice going forward and how to include them more in your practice going forward. So it's kind of like a conclusion to the book, wrapping it all up. Then she does give a reading list and then there's an index. So let's talk about the positives, and some of the positives obviously I've mentioned already, but let's just go over the things that stuck out for me the most. So Mallory offers great info on a variety of topics, from building your altar to veneration work, prayers, connecting with your ancestors and making offerings to them. All of that information was brilliant information, but also very simple and generic that you could literally Google. There is an excellent chapter on spiritual hygiene. Like I said, it is good information. However, it wasn't specific at all to ancestor work. It was just generic magical hygiene. And I personally felt it did not need to be in this book, and it took up space that another topic could have took up. The book focuses on groups of ancestor veneration rather than getting to know individual ancestors. Perfect for those of you out there who are not very good at research and don't know exactly who your ancestors are and how to research them. She talks about the groups such as blood ancestors, ancestors by marriage, recently deceased relatives, adoptive ancestors, and so on and so forth. She did also include, like I said, house spirits, land spirits, and non-human spirits. That to me was a complete waste of time and should not have been in the book. I will make a point that while we're talking on the subject of breaking down the book into groups of ancestors, she makes a big point in this book, and it's one of the biggest patterns in the book, that you do not need to know specifically who your ancestors are. I personally don't like that. I prefer to know who my ancestors are. But for those of you out there who are not big on research, who aren't really that interested in getting to know your ancestors by name and who they specifically were and what they did in their lives, this is probably a really good book for you because it's working with them more generically as a group of spirits rather than an individual spirit. So that's a positive for those of you who don't like research, but a negative for those of you who do prefer research and want to get to know your ancestors individually. Now for the negatives. She tells you that you don't need to get to know your ancestors. This is a negative for me personally because I find it disrespectful. I would rather know exactly who my ancestors are. I would rather know a little bit about them so I know who I'm calling upon and what kind of person they were in their life. and, you know, maybe how they died, because if they do have a traumatic death of some kind, that might affect my witchcraft and my spell working with them. So I do want to know who my ancestors are. What I found when I was progressing through this book, even though it was a big pattern at the beginning of the book for her saying you don't need to know who they are, there were certain points in the book where she was saying you actually probably need to know a specific ancestor for this particular type of working. So she actually contradicted herself, and she did that a number of times in regards to that topic, which I didn't like. The other thing is she gives you no information at all on how to research your ancestors, how to, you know, cross-reference and fact check the information you're being given. She gives you no resources, no websites, nothing. So if you actually want to research your ancestors, this is definitely not the book for you. She doesn't give you any helpful tips on how to do that whatsoever. So that is a big, firm negative for me. Mallory claims that we all have ancestral trauma, that the living are responsible for healing it. This was just a flat out lie and incorrect information, and the way it was worded, it sounds like she's making us as the living responsible for our ancestor trauma, which just simply isn't the case. You should never take on somebody else's trauma, somebody else's baggage. It is their baggage, it is their trauma. You can help them heal that trauma, but you're not responsible for it. So please ignore what she says in that chapter. It was worded very poorly and comes at it very incorrectly. Mallory also contradicts herself a lot in the book, actually in quite a number of places, claiming at the start of the book that you don't need to know who your ancestors are, and then changes her mind later on. She also does that in regards to things like offerings and your altars and things like that. So there was a number of patterns where she contradicted herself throughout the book, and it made it sound like she didn't know what she was talking about. And I honestly felt by the time I got to the end of this book that she's not very well versed in this particular topic, and that she got this information from other people and didn't really fact check it and check that what she was saying made sense to you as the reader. The worst part of the book for me was definitely the chapters on mediumship and the spells at the back of the book. The author said it herself, she's not a medium, so I don't know why she spoke on that particular subject. It just made her look a little bit stupid, in my opinion. The information was definitely incorrect when it comes to mediumship. The exercises were terrible, and most of them were actually psychic exercises, not mediumship exercises. The going deeper into mediumship was things like dream work, which has, you know, it's a topic in its own. It's not really about mediumship. While you can use dream work in mediumship if you've invited your spirits and your ancestors into your dreams, dream work on its own is an entire topic in witchcraft and has its own category. And that's just one example as well. So the information for me was incorrect in that chapter. The exercises were not particularly great. She was not knowledgeable on that subject at all, and I personally felt that she wasted time and energy by including it in this book. And the last point I want to make is Mallory did not cover the subject of reincarnation at all, and I'm finding that that's actually a common pattern in a lot of books that talk about ancestor veneration. What happens when your ancestors reincarnate? Can you still call upon their spirit? Does their spirit become fragmented, so you're calling upon the version of themselves from that particular life as your ancestor, and their living aspect, are they impacted by that calling upon their past self in any way? Does it harm them? Does it weaken them? Because they've split and they've been reincarnated, so they're human, they're alive on this plane of existence. What about the ancestor you're trying to connect to? Because they've been reborn, can you connect that energy? Does it still exist? And if it does, are you harming the living aspect of them by working with it? Are you working with a weaker version of your ancestor? And if an ancestor has not reincarnated, are they more powerful in comparison? There was questions there for me that could have been answered. There could have been a whole chapter on that. I also think spirit communication could have been included in this book. Tools to do that, and methods and techniques that have been commonly used throughout history. I also think she could have gone into greater detail historically in regards to burial rites, funerals, grieving process in regards to losing a loved one, and of course also focusing on how to include that ancestor on your ancestor altar because they're brand newly dead. Is there anything specific you should do? Should you introduce them to the rest of your ancestors before placing them on the altar? So there was a lot of things that she just did not include in this book that for me let it down. So my final opinion on this book is I did not enjoy it. I don't rate it and I don't recommend it. And for me, it was a 4 out of 10. I just could not give it a higher score than that. The 4 stands for the sections that I did enjoy, the information that was relevant, and the advice that she does give on how to connect with your ancestors and build an altar. Those were the best pieces of advice and information. The cleansing and spiritual hygiene section was good, but like I said, not relevant specifically to ancestors or this book. So 4 out of 10 from me, guys, and that concludes my review. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your support, and as always, take care of yourselves, and I will speak to you soon. Blessed be.